The knock came just after midnight, 3 soft raps against a door that hadn't been knocked on in 14 months. Louise stood in the hallway in her nightgown, one hand on the frame, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof like something trying to get in. When she opened the door, she found a man on her porch steps who looked less like a person and more like something the storm had chewed up and spit out. No coat, one shoe, a gash above his eyebrow crusted with mud and blood, and eyes that didn't seem to know where they were pointed. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for anything. He just stood there, swaying, until his knees gave out, and he went down onto her porch boards like a puppet with the strings cut. She would spend years afterward trying to explain why she didn't call anyone first, why she didn't hesitate. The truth was simpler than anyone wanted it to be. She looked at him, and something in her, something old and tired and grieving, whispered, "Feed him first. Ask later." She had no idea that the stranger dying on her porch was worth more money than her entire county. She had no idea that 14 hours later, he would do something that no one, not the bank, not the town, not even Louise herself, would ever be able to explain away as ordinary kindness returned. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If a stranger showed up at your door in the middle of a storm, soaked to the bone, starving, and unable to even remember his own name, would you let him in? Louise did. She had no idea what that decision would cost her or what it would give back to her. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the next morning changed not just her life, but the life of an entire town. If you've ever done something kind without expecting anything back, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Like this video if you believe kindness still means something in this world, and subscribe if you want more stories like Louise's. Now let's begin. Louise Hartman had lived on the same 11 acres for 41 years, and for the last 14 months, she had lived on them alone. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that the county stopped maintaining sometime around 2009, a low white farmhouse with a porch that sagged a half-inch more every winter and a barn that hadn't held an animal since the last of the goats died of old age. She grew what she could: tomatoes, squash, a stubborn row of sunflowers Foster had planted the spring before he got sick, and she sold what she couldn't eat at the Saturday market in town, driving the same rusted Ford pickup that had been there since 1997. Foster had been a quiet man, not withdrawn, not cold, quiet the way a deep well is quiet, full of things that didn't need to be said out loud to be felt. He'd spent 2 years in Vietnam as a young man and never talked about it except once, late at night, after too much coffee and not enough sleep, when he told her about a river and a boy and a decision he made in about 4 seconds that he said mattered more than anything else he'd ever done. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. She would understand it, fully, 30 years later, on a night she could never have predicted. He died on a Tuesday in March, the lung cancer finally winning after an 18-month fight that had eaten through their savings, their insurance, and most of what remained of the equity in the house. Louise had signed papers she barely read in those final months: home equity lines, a second mortgage, a loan against the land itself, because there hadn't been time to think, only time to try to keep him comfortable and keep the lights on. By the time the funeral was over, she owed more on the property than most people in town made in 3 years combined. The bank had been patient, at first. Patient the way institutions are patient, with letters, then calls. Then a man named Sherman Voss who wore a tie even in August and always sat with his hands folded like he was already grieving something. He'd given her extensions twice. The third time he came, he didn't sit down. "Mrs. Hartman," he'd said, standing in her kitchen with a folder under his arm, "I've done what I can. The board isn't going to authorize a 4th extension. You have until the end of next month." She had nodded because there was nothing else to do, and she had watched him walk back to his car past the sunflowers Foster planted, and she had thought, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that grief doesn't ask permission before it multiplies. Some nights, Louise still set 2 plates out of habit before catching herself and putting one back in the cupboard. She kept Foster's boots by the door because moving them felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, and she kept his side of the closet exactly as it was, not out of denial, she told herself, but because there hadn't yet been a reason strong enough to change it. Grief, she had learned, didn't move in a straight line. It circled back on ordinary Tuesdays, in the smell of a particular soap, in the sound of a truck engine that wasn't quite his idling at the end of the drive. Her daughter, who worked nights at a hospital 40 minutes away, sent her granddaughter Poppy out most weekends. Partly for the fresh air, partly, Louise suspected, because her daughter worried about her mother rattling around that house alone with nothing but silence and a debt she couldn't outrun. Poppy was 9, all elbows and questions, and she was the only thing that still made Louise laugh without having to try. Her neighbor Dalton, a retired mechanic who lived a half-mile down the road, checked in most days, fixed what he could fix for free, and never once mentioned the for sale sign he'd noticed leaning against the inside of her barn wall, waiting. That was the shape of Louise's life the night the storm rolled in. A woman running out of time, on land she couldn't afford to keep, carrying a grief she hadn't finished carrying, when a man she had never seen before in her life collapsed on her porch and changed the direction of everything. She didn't call an ambulance first. That would come later, once she understood he wasn't going to die on her porch in the next 5 minutes. What she did first was drag him, and he was heavier than he looked, all long limbs and dead weight, through the front door and onto the braided rug in the living room, the same rug Foster used to fall asleep on watching Sunday football. She got a fire going in the wood stove with hands that shook, and she peeled off what was left of his ruined jacket, a jacket that, she noticed even in her panic, was made of some fabric finer than anything hanging in her own closet, torn now beyond saving. He came to briefly while she was wrapping him in a quilt, his eyes opening halfway, unfocused, his lips moving around words that didn't quite form. She leaned close. "Can you tell me your name, honey?" she asked. "Do you know where you are?" He looked at her, really looked, for just a second, and something crossed his face that wasn't confusion. It was closer to disbelief, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see again. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, breathing shallow, and she decided the ambulance question could wait until she'd at least gotten some warmth and food into him, because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on roads that flooded in weather like this, and something in her gut told her he needed heat and broth before he needed a gurney. She heated the leftover vegetable soup from dinner, the kind she made every week from whatever the garden gave up, and she spent 20 minutes coaxing spoonfuls between his lips while he lay half-conscious against the couch cushions she'd propped behind him. He swallowed instinctively, like an animal too far gone to know it was being fed, and slowly, spoonful by spoonful, some color came back into his face. It was near 2 in the morning when he finally opened his eyes and stayed with her, blinking at the ceiling, then at the fire, then at her. "Where?" His voice came out as a rasp, and used for what must have been days. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Louise said, which was the only true thing she could offer. "You collapsed on my porch. I've got soup, and there's a bed made up if you can walk to it. Do you have a name I can call you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands like he was trying to recognize them. "I don't," he stopped, started again. "I don't know how long I've been out there." "Out where?" "The woods." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the dark tree line beyond her fence, the same woods that ran for nearly 6 miles before hitting the county road. "I was walking. I think I fell. Or, I don't remember falling. I remember being cold, and then I don't remember anything until your porch." Louise studied him in the firelight, the ruined remains of what had clearly once been an expensive shirt, the watch on his wrist, cracked but unmistakably the kind of watch that cost more than her truck, hands that had never done a day of farm labor despite the blisters now forming on them from days of wandering. Nothing about him added up to a man lost in the woods behind her house. But she had learned, over 66 years, that people rarely arrived at your door with their whole story attached, and that asking too many questions too fast was a good way to make a frightened person shut down completely. "Well," she said, standing and reaching for another blanket, "you don't have to figure all that out tonight. Tonight you eat, you sleep, and tomorrow we figure out who to call." He caught her wrist, weakly, before she could turn away. His grip had almost no strength in it, but the gesture itself carried something urgent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Louise looked down at him, at this stranger with the ruined clothes and the untouched hands and the eyes that kept drifting to the photograph on her mantel. A young man in uniform, squinting into a sun that had set decades ago. And she said the only thing that felt honest. "My husband used to say the same thing," she said quietly. "That kindness without conditions is the only kind that means anything. He's not here to practice what he preached anymore. So I suppose I'm doing it for both of us." She didn't notice, in that moment, how long his gaze lingered on the photograph over the mantel before his eyes finally closed. Before that, though, She sat up a while longer beside him, unable to make herself go to bed while a stranger's fever still lingered in her front room. She listened to the rain slow to a drizzle against the windows, watched the fire burn down to embers, and found herself talking to him even though he couldn't hear her, telling him, in a low voice, about the sunflowers Foster planted, about the goats that used to wander the yard, about how strange it was that the house had gone from feeling too full to feeling too empty in the space of a single illness. It wasn't until the sky had started to gray at the edges that she finally allowed herself to drift off in the armchair beside him, one hand still resting near enough to feel if his breathing changed. By morning, he was sleeping deeply in the spare room down the hall, the room that had been meant for grandchildren who never quite stayed over often enough to need it. And Louise sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, staring at the phone, trying to decide who exactly you were supposed to call when a half-dead stranger showed up in a storm and refused, gently but firmly, to let you call the sheriff. He slept for nearly 18 hours. Louise checked on him every hour or two, the way she'd checked on Foster in his last months, out of habit as much as concern, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Dalton stopped by around noon, took one look at the stranger through the cracked bedroom door, and pulled Louise into the kitchen with his eyebrows halfway up his forehead. "You know this fella's got a Swiss watch worth more than my truck," Dalton said, keeping his voice low. "And no wallet, no ID, nothing in his pockets but a busted phone with no signal and a hotel key card from someplace 2 states over." "I know," Louise admitted. "You called the sheriff?" "He asked me not to. Said he wants a chance to remember things on his own first. Said if I bring in the sheriff, whoever he's running from might find him before he figures out who he even is." Dalton didn't look convinced, and Louise didn't blame him. It didn't sound convincing, said out loud in her kitchen in the middle of the afternoon. But something about the way the man had said it, not paranoid, not dramatic, just quietly certain, had settled something in her. She'd spent a lifetime reading people, first as a schoolteacher, and then as a farmer's wife who had to know instantly whether a stranger at the gate was selling something or needed something. And every instinct she had told her this man wasn't dangerous. He was drowning in something, and it wasn't the storm. He woke for good around 6 that evening, wandering into the kitchen on unsteady legs in a set of Foster's old clothes Louise had left folded on the bed, jeans too short for him, a flannel shirt straining across shoulders broader than her husband's had ever been. He looked, for a moment, like a man wearing another man's life, and something about that image made Louise's chest ache in a way she didn't examine too closely. "I remember my name," he said, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed in. "Desmond. Just Desmond. For now." A ghost of something like a smile crossed his face. "It's coming back in pieces. Like fog burning off. I remember I was flying somewhere. I remember the engine. Something was wrong with the engine. And then I remember trees, a lot of trees, and walking for what felt like days but was probably closer to 2. You were in a plane crash?" Louise set down the dish towel she'd been holding, alarm sharpening in her voice. "A hard landing," Desmond corrected, though his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely sure of the distinction himself. "In a field somewhere east of here, I think. I walked away from it. I'm fairly sure the pilot did too. I remember him. Remember telling him to go get help while I went to look for a road. I don't remember why I thought that was a good idea instead of staying put." He rubbed at the gash above his eyebrow, wincing. "I don't remember much of anything clearly until your porch." Louise made him sit, made him eat again, real food this time, eggs and toast, and the last of the bacon she'd been saving, and watched him eat like a man who'd genuinely forgotten what it felt like to not be hungry. There was something almost unbearable about watching someone eat that way. Something that reminded her too sharply of Foster in his final months, when his appetite left him entirely and she used to beg him, plate after plate, to just try one more bite. "You should let me take you to the hospital," she said. "Or at least let me call someone. Family. Somebody's got to be looking for you." Something shifted in Desmond's face, a flicker of pain that had nothing to do with his injuries. "There's someone," he admitted. "A woman who works for me. Marisol. She's probably already got half a search team combing 3 counties by now. She doesn't give up." He set down his fork. "But I'm not ready yet." "Not ready for what?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the darkening fields beyond, at the barn, at the fence line disappearing into the tree shadow. 3 days ago," he said slowly, I found out that someone I trusted with almost everything I've built spent the last 2 years planning to take it from me. Quietly, legally, with my own signature on half the paperwork, because I trusted him enough not to read the fine print. By the time I found out, it was already done. I got on a plane because I couldn't stand to be in the same building as the people who let it happen, and I told the pilot to just fly. And somewhere over these mountains the engine started failing, and I thought. He stopped himself. You thought what? Louise asked gently. I thought maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if it didn't end well. He said it flatly, like a man reporting the weather, but Louise heard what was underneath it, and something in her chest cracked open with recognition. She knew that particular exhaustion. She had lived inside it for months after Foster died, in the specific gray hours of early morning when the house was too quiet and the grief too loud. But it did end well, she said. The plane landed. You walked away. I walked into the woods for 2 days without any real intention of walking back out, Desmond said. I'm not proud of that. I don't fully understand it myself, even now. But something made me keep moving instead of just sitting down and letting the cold finish it. I don't know what. Louise reached across the table, an instinct older than thought, and put her hand over his. I do, she said. It's the same thing that got me out of bed every morning for 14 months after my husband died, when I didn't particularly want to be alive either. You don't always know why you keep going. You just do. And eventually, you end up somewhere unexpected. Desmond looked at her hand on his, then up at her face, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. Recognition, maybe, of two people standing at the edge of the same kind of darkness from very different directions. That night, before bed, Desmond stood in the hallway for a long time in front of the photograph on the mantel, the young soldier squinting into decades-old sunlight, and Louise, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw his hand rise slowly toward the frame before he caught himself and let it fall back to his side. By the third day, Desmond was strong enough to help around the property, and Louise let him, mostly because idleness seemed to eat at him worse than the injuries had. He fixed a section of fence that had been sagging since before Foster got sick, working with the careful, uncertain hands of a man who had clearly never done manual labor in his life, but refused to admit it. Poppy arrived that Saturday for her weekend visit and took to him instantly, the way children take to anyone who answers their questions with actual thought instead of dismissal, following him around the property asking why the sky was blue and whether he'd ever seen a bear and if he was Grandma's boyfriend now, which made Desmond laugh, a real laugh, startled out of him, for the first time since Louise had known him. But it was the photograph that kept pulling him back. She found him standing in front of it again that evening, after Poppy had gone to bed, his expression unreadable in the low lamplight. That's my husband, Louise said, coming to stand beside him. Foster. That picture was taken right before he shipped out to Vietnam, 1969. He was 22. He looks kind, Desmond said quietly. He was. Quietest man I ever knew, and the kindest. Took me 11 years of marriage to get half his war stories out of him, and even then, only the ones he thought were worth telling. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. He used to say the war didn't make him who he was. Said he was already that person before he left, and the war just tested it and confirmed it, one bad day at a time. Desmond's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Did he ever talk about a river? Louise turned to look at him, something cold moving through her stomach at the specificity of the question. How would you know about that? I don't know that I do, Desmond said carefully. I've been having pieces since the crash. Not memories of the last few days, older ones, coming up out of nowhere, the way things do sometimes when your head's been rattled. There's a river in one of them, cold water. Someone pulling me out of it, a long time ago, when I was small. A man's arms. I couldn't have been older than 7. Louise's hand rose slowly to her mouth. He told me about that, she whispered. Once. Late at night, years and years ago. Said he was on leave, home for 2 weeks before shipping back out, and he was walking near a river with some army buddies when he heard a kid screaming. Said the current had a boy, must have fallen in off the rocks, and Foster went in without thinking twice about it, in his boots and everything, and pulled him out. Said the boy's family was so grateful they tried to give him money, and he wouldn't take a dime, just told them to teach the boy to swim and walked away. He never even asked the family's name. Said it wasn't about being thanked. The silence that followed stretched long enough that the wood stove's crackling seemed unbearably loud. I don't know if it's the same river, Desmond said finally, his voice unsteady in a way it hadn't been before. not even when he was talking about the plane crash. I don't know if it's the same man. I was 7. I don't remember his face, not really, just his arms, and the sound of him telling me to breathe. Breathe. You're okay? I've got you. I remember my mother crying so hard, she couldn't stand up straight. I remember him refusing the money my father tried to give him. And I remember, years later, when I was old enough to understand what almost happened that day, asking my mother his name, and she said she never found out. Said he just walked away like it was nothing. Louise sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. Where? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Where was this river? Tennessee, Desmond said. Near a little town I couldn't even find on a map anymore. My family was passing through, visiting my grandmother. It would have been 1978, maybe 1979. Louise's eyes filled, and she pressed a hand against her chest as if she could physically hold together whatever was cracking open inside her. Foster was on leave in Tennessee in the summer of '78, she said, visiting his own mother. Before we were even married, before I knew him. She looked up at Desmond, and something in her face had transformed. Not fear, not suspicion, but a kind of stunned, trembling wonder. I think, she said slowly, I think my husband may have saved your life 47 years ago, and neither one of you ever knew the other's name until right now. Desmond stood very still, staring at the photograph of the young soldier who had, quite possibly, once carried him out of a river and back into a life he would spend the next 5 decades building into an empire, a life Foster had never once tried to claim credit for, never mentioned it in any way that suggested he expected anything in return, never even knew whether the boy grew up to do anything at all with the second chance he'd been given. He's gone, Desmond said, and it wasn't a question. 14 months ago. Louise's voice broke slightly. I never got to thank whoever it was that shaped him into the man capable of doing something like that. I never even knew the story mattered to anyone but us. Desmond turned away from the photograph, and for the first time since Louise had pulled him off her porch, she saw something in his face that looked less like exhaustion and more like purpose, quiet and enormous and still taking shape. I need to tell you who I am, he said. All of it, not the pieces. And then I need you to understand why I have to do something about this, whether you want me to or not. What Desmond told her that night, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd fed him soup 4 nights earlier, took nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, Louise understood that the man in her spare bedroom was not simply a lost hiker who'd stumbled onto her land. He was the founder of a logistics and technology company that employed almost 30,000 people, a man whose name she would have recognized instantly if she read the kind of magazines that sat in dentists' waiting rooms, a man worth, by conservative estimate, somewhere north of $4 billion. He told her about Bram, his co-founder, his closest friend for over 20 years, the man he'd trusted enough to hand controlling shares to during a health scare 8 years earlier, never fully reclaiming them because there had never seemed to be a reason to. He told her how, 3 days before the crash, he'd discovered that Bram had spent 2 years quietly building a coalition of board members, restructuring voting rights, and orchestrating a hostile buyout that would strip Desmond of his own company using mechanisms Desmond himself had unknowingly signed off on in the fine print of routine paperwork. He told her about the meeting where he'd realized, in real time, that the friend across the table wasn't going to blink, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to do anything but calmly explain that it was, legally, all above board. He told her about getting on the plane afterward with no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to be somewhere the phone couldn't reach him, and about the engine failure, and the hard landing in a fallow field, and the 2 days of walking through unfamiliar woods with a head injury and no food, during which, he admitted this quietly, staring at the table rather than at her, he had, more than once, simply stopped walking and sat down against a tree, in no particular hurry to get back up. I wasn't trying to die, he clarified, though his voice suggested even he wasn't entirely certain of the distinction. I just stopped caring, for a while, whether I lived. There's a difference, even if it doesn't look like much of one from the outside. Louise, who had sat in her own dark kitchen more nights than she'd ever admit to anyone, simply nodded, because she understood the difference completely. She told him, in turn, about the winter after Foster's diagnosis when she'd sat in this same kitchen at 3 in the morning doing math that never came out right, trying to figure out how many more treatments they could afford before there was nothing left to sell but the land itself. She told him how she used to drive to the pharmacy and sit in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in, just to compose her face into something that wouldn't worry him when she brought the medicine home. Desmond listened the way she hadn't been listened to in a long time, not waiting for his turn to speak, not offering the tired condolences people default to, just present, absorbing it, the way you listen to someone when their pain has finally made you recognize your own. "I think that's why I told you all of this," he admitted. "Most people who ask about the crash want the version with a moral already attached. You didn't ask for a moral. You just asked if I was hungry." He told her, too, about the fragments that had surfaced during those 2 days. Old memories, dislodged by the head injury, or the exhaustion, or simply by being that close to death and having nothing left to distract him from his own mind. The river had come back to him somewhere on the second day, vivid and cold and terrifying, and he hadn't understood why until he saw the photograph on her mantle and felt something in his chest recognize a face he shouldn't have been able to recognize at all. "I've spent almost 50 years being grateful to a man whose name I never knew," he said. "I built an entire foundation, a real one, that funds water safety programs and swim lessons in low-income communities across 6 states. Because of that day, because I wanted to make sure no other kid went under the way I almost did. I never told anyone the real reason why. Everyone assumed it was just good corporate philanthropy. It was never about the company. It was about a man who pulled me out of a river and refused to take a single dollar for it. And I never got the chance to say thank you. He wouldn't have wanted you to," Louise said softly. "That's the truth of it. That's exactly who he was." "I understand that," Desmond said. "But I'm not the same as him. I have resources he never had, and a debt he never asked me to pay. And I think I finally understand why I ended up here, on this specific property, out of every acre of forest in 3 counties. I don't believe much in fate. I've spent my life believing in spreadsheets and hard work and calculated risk. But I walked out of those woods and collapsed on the one porch in the entire county that belonged to the widow of the man who saved my life. And I don't have a rational explanation for that. I just have gratitude and an opportunity, and I intend to use it." The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, Sherman Voss's sedan came crawling up the gravel drive, 3 weeks earlier than his scheduled deadline, with a second car following behind it that Louise didn't recognize, sleek, black, entirely out of place against the mud and the fence posts. Louise's stomach dropped, certain the bank had finally decided to move early, certain her time had simply run out faster than promised. She had no idea that the second car carried Marisol, who had tracked Desmond's last cell signal to within 11 miles of this exact property and had spent the last 2 days working with local authorities to narrow the search, and that Sherman's early arrival was pure, unrelated coincidence. A foreclosure notice he intended to deliver in person that Louise would never actually have to read, because by the time he stepped out of his car, everything about her situation was about to become permanently, irreversibly different. Louise stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself against the morning cold, watching Sherman approach with a folder tucked under his arm and an expression that suggested he found no particular joy in what he was about to do. Behind him, a woman in a sharp gray coat was climbing out of the black sedan, moving fast, scanning the property with the focused urgency of someone who had been searching for days and refused to let hope get ahead of confirmation. "Mrs. Hartman," Sherman began, "I know this is earlier than we discussed, but the board asked me to." "Desmond." The woman's voice cut across the yard, cracking slightly. "Desmond, oh my God." He came out onto the porch behind Louise at the sound of his name, still wearing Foster's ill-fitting flannel shirt, the gash above his eyebrow now scabbed over, and the woman, Marisol, crossed the muddy yard at something close to a run and threw her arms around him with the kind of relief that comes only after days of fearing the worst. "We had 3 counties searching," she said into his shoulder, her voice shaking. "The pilot said you walked off into the tree line and didn't look back. We thought." She pulled back, gripping his arms, checking him over like she needed physical proof he was whole. "Bram's been telling the board you're incapacitated. He's been moving faster than we thought. If we don't get you in front of a camera and a lawyer within 48 hours, there may not be a company left for you to come back to." Sherman, meanwhile, had gone very still on the porch steps, his folder forgotten at his side, staring at Desmond with the particular expression of a man slowly recalculating everything he thought he understood about his morning. Sherman started. I know who I am, Desmond said, not unkindly. Give me a moment, Sherman, and I'll explain everything. But first, he turned to Louise, and something in his posture shifted. Not the exhausted, grateful man who'd eaten her soup 4 nights ago, but a man stepping fully back into the size of the life he actually led, doing it deliberately, and doing it for her. Marisol, he said, I need you to get Bram's lawyers on the phone within the hour, and I need you to get our foundation's counsel here today, not tomorrow. And Sherman, he turned to the loan officer, whose folder was still hanging forgotten at his side. How much does Mrs. Hartman currently owe on this property? Total, principal, and outstanding interest? Sherman blinked. I'm not authorized to discuss another client's financials in front of. I'm not asking as a stranger, Desmond said. I'm asking as the man about to purchase the debt directly, in full, this morning, along with every other outstanding agricultural loan your bank currently holds against small landowners in this county who are at risk of foreclosure in the next 12 months. I'd like the number, please, so my team can begin the paperwork today. The yard went silent except for the wind moving through the sunflowers. Louise stared at him, her mouth open, no sound coming out. Sherman looked between the two of them like he was trying to determine whether this was some kind of elaborate practical joke. Desmond, Louise finally managed. You don't have to. I'm not doing this because I have to, he said, turning to face her fully, his voice quieter now, meant only for her even with the others standing close. I've spent almost 50 years grateful to a man I never got the chance to thank, and I have spent 4 days grateful to a woman who fed a stranger without asking a single question about what she might get in return. I'm not paying off a debt to you, Louise. I'm paying off a debt to him, through you, because you're the only part of him left that I can reach. This isn't charity. This is the most overdue bill of my entire life, and I intend to pay it, all of it, starting with this property and ending with every family in this county who's ever stood where you're standing right now. Louise's knees buckled slightly, and Dalton, who had come running up the drive at the sight of the strange black car, caught her elbow just in time to steady her. There's more, Desmond continued, and there was something in his voice now that carried, that seemed to want the whole yard, the whole county, to hear it. I'd like to establish a foundation, here, on this land, in Foster Hartman's name, that funds water safety education, veteran support services, and small farm preservation loans across this entire region. Not run from some city office 600 miles from here. Run from this property, if you'll allow it, with you as its director, because nobody else alive understands what this land, and what that man, actually meant. I don't want a plaque with his name on it in some building he never set foot in. I want the actual place where he lived and worked and loved you to become the reason other people get a second chance the way I did. Marisol, recovering her professional composure faster than anyone else in the yard, was already scrolling through something on her phone. Desmond, if you do this publicly, in this condition, Bram's people will say you're not of sound mind. They'll use it. You need a lawyer in the room before you make a single commitment out loud. Then get one on the phone right now and have them listen, Desmond said, not taking his eyes off Louise. I don't need to be presentable for this. I needed 4 days without a boardroom to understand what actually matters. And I'm not going to let a man who tried to steal my company also steal my ability to say thank you to the one person who never once asked what I could do for her. He turned to Marisol fully. Draft the purchase agreement for the loan portfolio today. I want county records pulled on every agricultural property within 20 miles that's behind on payments. And call the foundations board. Tell them we're relocating operational headquarters. To where? Marisol asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Here, Desmond said simply. This kitchen table has more integrity in it than most of our conference rooms combined. Sherman, still holding his forgotten foreclosure folder, slowly lowered himself onto the porch steps, looking like a man who had arrived expecting to deliver bad news and instead witnessed something he would be telling people about for the rest of his career. When he finally found his voice again, it came out smaller than his usual bank-issued authority. Mrs. Hartman, he said, I need you to know, none of this was personal. I hope you understand that. I know, Sherman, Louise said, and to his visible surprise, she reached out and squeezed his shoulder. You had a job to do. I never blamed you for doing it, but I think, From here on out, that job's about to look a little different." Louise pressed both hands over her mouth, tears finally breaking free and running down her face in the cold morning light. And behind her, through the screen door, Poppy stood in her pajamas, wide-eyed, having woken to the sound of strange cars and stranger conversation, watching her grandmother's entire world reshape itself in the space of a single sentence. The weeks that followed were not simple, and Louise would later say that anyone who expected them to be simple hadn't lived long enough to understand how complicated a good thing can be. The news of Desmond's survival broke within hours, and with it came reporters, camera crews parked at the end of her gravel drive, in a strange, unsettling period where Louise's name appeared in headlines she never asked to be part of. Bram's takeover attempt collapsed within days once Desmond appeared, very publicly, very alive, flanked by lawyers who unwound the fraudulent board maneuvering piece by piece. Bram resigned from the company amid a wave of shareholder lawsuits, and Desmond, to Louise's quiet surprise, refused every opportunity to publicly humiliate the man who had betrayed him, choosing instead a careful, private legal settlement that ended their partnership without turning it into spectacle. "He took something from me," Desmond told her one evening. Weeks later, sitting on her porch steps as the sun went down over the fence Foster had built decades earlier. "But hating him publicly wouldn't have given me back a single thing that matters. I learned that from watching you these past weeks. You never once asked what was in it for you. I figured the least I could do was try to leave this the same way." Sherman, for his part, underwent a transformation of his own, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. He stayed on as the bank's regional contact for the new foundation's small farm loan program, and Louise noticed, over the following months, that he started showing up to community meetings without his tie, that he began advocating internally for softer terms on families facing the same crisis she'd faced, that the man who'd once stood in her kitchen delivering deadlines began, slowly, to see the faces behind the folders he carried. Not everything was resolved with the neatness of a fairy tale. Louise's daughter worried, at first, that her mother was being used, or worse, being taken advantage of by a wealthy man with unclear motives, and it took several long, honest conversations, and eventually meeting Desmond herself, before that worry softened into something more like cautious trust. There were nights Louise sat alone at her kitchen table with the paperwork for the new foundation spread out in front of her, overwhelmed, missing Foster so intensely she could barely breathe, wondering if she was equal to the size of what was being asked of her. She was 66 years old, and the life she had built for herself out of grief and stubbornness and 11 quiet acres was suddenly attached to something enormous, something with staff and budgets and a mission statement, and some mornings that felt like more loss than gift, another piece of her old life dissolving into something she hadn't chosen. But Desmond didn't disappear once the paperwork was signed, the way she half expected a man of his stature to do. He came back, not as a benefactor swooping in for photo opportunities, but as someone who genuinely seemed to need the quiet of that farmhouse as much as she once had. He learned to mend fence properly, calluses finally forming where blisters had been. He sat with Poppy on the porch steps and let her teach him the names of constellations she'd learned in school, getting every single one wrong on purpose just to hear her laugh. And on the anniversary of Foster's death, without being asked, he drove 3 hours to bring back a smooth river stone he'd found near the exact spot where, according to Old County records Marisol had painstakingly tracked down, a young soldier once pulled a drowning boy out of the current in the summer of 1978. "I wanted him to have something back from that river," Desmond said, placing the stone in Louise's palm. "Since I couldn't give it to him directly." Louise closed her fingers around it and, for the first time in 14 months, cried in a way that felt less like grief and more like release. There was one conversation, in particular, she never forgot from that stretch of difficult, transitional weeks. A reporter, doing a follow-up piece on the story that had briefly made national news, asked Louise flatly whether she regretted opening her door to a stranger she knew nothing about. Louise had thought about the question longer than the reporter probably expected. "If I'd known who he was, I might have hesitated," she finally said. "Might have wondered what he wanted, what it would cost me to get involved. That's the trouble with knowing things in advance. It gives you too many excuses to look away. I didn't know anything except that a man was dying on my porch. That turned out to be all I needed to know." By the following spring, The Foster Hartman Foundation for River Safety and Rural Resilience had funded free swim lessons for over 4,000 children across 3 states, established an emergency loan fund that had already kept 11 family farms from foreclosure in Louise's county alone, and begun construction on a small community center at the edge of Louise's property, modest, wood-framed, nothing that would ever appear in a magazine, built with the same unpretentious practicality Foster himself would have insisted on if anyone had asked him. Louise still grew her tomatoes and her stubborn sunflowers. She still drove the same rusted Ford pickup to Saturday market, though now she drove past a hand-painted sign at the end of her gravel road that read simply Hartman Community Farm, no mention of the money behind it, exactly as she'd requested. Sherman still visited, tireless now, bringing his own children by sometimes to help with the harvest. Dalton had taken on a paid position managing the foundation's small farm equipment program, grinning about it in a way that suggested he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Poppy, who had once asked a starving stranger if he was her grandmother's boyfriend, had grown 2 inches and developed an entirely unshakable conviction that she would run the whole operation herself one day, and nobody who knew her doubted it for a second. Desmond split his time now between the company he'd rebuilt on steadier, more transparent footing and the farmhouse at the end of the gravel road, where he kept, permanently, a room that had once been meant for grandchildren and was now simply his. Not because Louise had asked him to stay, but because neither of them had ever quite figured out a version of this new life that made sense without the other in it. He was careful never to call it a replacement for what Foster had been to her. He didn't need to. What existed between them had its own shape entirely, something built out of a debt 50 years old, paid forward through a woman who had simply been kind to a stranger without knowing what that stranger carried. The community center finished construction in early June, and the town gathered for its opening on a warm Saturday morning that smelled like cut grass and fresh paint. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras, no speeches from anyone important. Desmond had insisted on that, over the objections of 2 separate publicity consultants. Just tables of food brought by neighbors, children running through the sprinklers Dalton had rigged up along the new building's foundation, and a small bronze plaque by the front door that read only, in memory of a man who never asked for thanks. Pass it on. Louise had chosen the words herself, and when Desmond read them for the first time, he stood in front of that plaque for a long while, the way he'd once stood in front of the photograph on her mantel, before quietly stepping back to let the celebration move around him. Poppy, older now and considerably more confident in her opinions, had taken to giving unsolicited tours of the property to any visitor who wandered too close, narrating the story of the porch and the storm and the soup with the dramatic flair of a girl who understood, on some instinctive level, that she was standing inside the kind of story people would tell for a long time after she was grown. On the anniversary of the night he collapsed on her porch, Desmond stood again in front of the photograph on the mantel, the young soldier squinting into decades-old sunlight, and this time, he didn't stop his hand from rising. He touched the edge of the frame gently, the way you might touch the shoulder of someone you'd waited your whole life to properly thank. "I got there eventually," he said quietly, to a man who had never known his name and had never asked to be repaid. "Took me 47 years, but I got there." Behind him, through the kitchen window, Louise watched him, the river stone from his gift sitting on the windowsill, where the morning light caught it every day at the same hour, and she thought, not for the first time, that some debts take an entire lifetime to come due, and that the waiting, however long, never makes the payment less extraordinary when it finally arrives. Louise never set out to change anyone's life that night. She opened a door because a man was dying on her porch, and she fed him because that was simply who she was, the same way it had simply been who Foster was, decades before her, standing beside a river with no intention of asking anyone's name. Perhaps that's the only real explanation for what happened next. Not fate, not coincidence, just 2 ordinary people, 47 years apart, choosing kindness in a moment when it would have been easier not to. The world rarely tells you, in the instant you're being kind to someone, what that kindness is quietly repaying or what it might one day return. Louise found that out on a stormy night that started with an empty bowl of soup and ended with a farmhouse full of people who had nowhere else they'd rather be. Somewhere, a river keeps running past a bend nobody remembers the name of, indifferent to any of it. And somewhere else, a stone sits on a windowsill, catching the morning light, exactly where it was always meant to land. There is no ledger for the kind of debt Foster and Louise paid, no interest rate, no due date stamped on an envelope from a bank. There is only the quiet, stubborn habit of choosing decency before you know whether it will ever be returned to you, and the rare, unrepeatable mornings when it is, in ways no one could have planned for, and no one will ever quite be able to explain. If there is a lesson in it at all, it isn't one Louise would ever say out loud. She would simply open the door again, the exact same way, if it happened tomorrow. That, in the end, is the only answer this story was ever trying to give.